Are you interested in discovering the spiritual and theological mysteries of the Old Testament, as well as exploring the current historical and archaeological evidence that supports or confounds the biblical narrative? If so, prepare to have your eyes opened as we journey to Damascus. Hello there, and welcome to our Sunday school, adult Sunday school of Journey to Damascus. We're trying something a little different today. We are doing this to you from St. James Studios in the nursery of the downstairs of St. James, where we have a nice green screen up, and we're bringing you a production that we hope you'll find entertaining as we show pictures and things that you can see well. That'll be right behind me here. I have never done anything in front of a green screen before. So, bear with me. If I point in the wrong direction, you gotta remember, I can't see anything that you see behind me. So I'm gonna give this my best shot. Wish me luck, and let's go ahead and get started. We finished up our review of 1 Samuel, and actually Genesis through 1 Samuel. But at the end of the last session in 1 Samuel, we ended up with Samuel becomes judge of Israel, one of the leaders, one of the military leaders, and the prophets from God. Israel then tells Samuel, the people of Israel, that they no longer want God to be their leader. In a sense, they want a human king, just like the other nations have. Samuel tries to talk them out of it, but they're not going to hear of it. God tells Samuel, it's okay, they're rejecting me, not you. Go ahead and give them what they're asking for. So what they get is Saul. And Saul is anointed. He turns out to be a less than perfect king. But as God said, the people get what they ask for. We then heard about Saul's falling from grace with God, and then how David, the little shepherd boy, son of Jesse, is anointed by Samuel to be the next king of Israel. However, Saul has years and years and years to continue reigning before David does actually become the king of Israel. So that's where we pick up the story, and I'll take us from there. I think I touched on a little bit last time of the relationship between David and Saul's son, Jonathan. They are fast friends. They are bosom buddies. They have a connection with each other deep in the soul. And so there's a struggle through many of these chapters between Jonathan, his father, Saul, and David. A little bit between David and Jonathan, because Jonathan doesn't always believe David necessarily that his father Saul wants to kill David, because Saul's so convincing to Jonathan that he's not really trying to kill David. All right, well, we finished up, and we heard about how jealous Saul was becoming of David and David's fame with all the people. But we also, as I said, heard about the bond that was developed between David and Saul's son, Jonathan. I have a picture here. This is Gustave Doré's picture of Jonathan and David and their friendship. Time and again, Jonathan tries to reason with his father Saul and tell him, why is it that you're against David? David's a good guy. Look at all the great stuff he's done. And Saul, at times, seems to accept that, but immediately, when he's alone, this troubled thing in his soul just doesn't let him trust David, and he gets angry and he goes after David time and time again. Usually these encounters, Saul seems to agree with his son, like I said, and is reasoned with, but he always seems to turn around. Saul's also very jealous of David. In his heart, he knows that his son Jonathan won't be the next king, which he very much wants him to be. But he knows that it's David who is favored by God and has been anointed by Samuel and will indeed be the next king unless Saul can kill David, thereby making some opening there for Jonathan to be the next king. So Saul tries time and again to get David killed any way he can. One day Saul sends troops to watch the house of David and his wife, Michal, who is Saul's daughter. They watch the house all night, but Michal gets wind of what's going on and knows the house is being watched. She convinces David that he needs to sneak out a back window, which she helps him do. She dresses up some little mannequin and puts some goat hair on its head and tries to fool the guards that that's actually David and he's sick and bad, and they give it a lot of time, and they eventually figure out what's going on, and she gets in trouble with her father, but she says that David threatened to kill her if she didn't help him escape, which wasn't true at all, but she had to say that so her father wouldn't be too angry with her. Next, Saul learns that David is with Samuel, so he sends troops up there to where Samuel is to try to catch David there. Funny thing about this is as the troops come, God gives them the gift of prophecy, which in these times what it is the gift of speaking God's word. God's word could have been how great David is, how much David is loved by the people, and anything that God had them say. And all the troops that came to capture David end up prophesying about what a great guy he is instead. Well, Saul hears about this, so he sends more troops, and the same thing happens to them. And then a third time he sends troops, and the same thing happens to them. So finally, Saul himself goes up with troops to see if he can't get David, and it turns out that Saul ends up prophesying, talking about how great a guy David is, how wonderful a person he is. He can't help himself. He doesn't want to say these things, but he can't help himself. He ends up stripping his clothes off and standing in front of Samuel naked, saying what a great guy David is, because that's the only thing that can come out of his mouth. I kind of thought of it as, never mind, I'm not even going to say that. So, see, I do catch myself every now and then. Finally, Jonathan, you see another picture here, which is a picture of David and Jonathan, as depicted by Rembrandt. Finally, Jonathan, who didn't believe that his father was still trying to kill David, devises a plan to see if his dad is really still trying to kill David. And there's a festival, and he sits at the table with him, and David is not there. And the festival's 3 days long, and he tells his father, who asks where David is, that David's just gone off to be with his family for a little bit. And the next day of the festival, David still isn't there. Of course, Saul was planning on killing David at this festival, but he doesn't show up. Finally, Jonathan tells his father that he told David it'd be okay to be away for the whole time of the festival. Saul gets so angry at Jonathan that, reminiscent of throwing a spear at David at one point, he throws a spear at his own son Jonathan, and is just infuriated by the fact that he let David get away with this. Okay, it's a very emotional moment also between Jonathan and his father, as Jonathan comes to realize that his father's been lying to him all along and truly wants to kill David, who Jonathan loves so much as a friend and as a good man. So David runs away to the only place he can escape Saul, and that's the Philistine land of Gath, where he is captured by some who believe him to indeed be David, the hero of Israel. They drag him before the king, Achish, but in the story, David acts crazy and gnaws at the doors and drools all over his beard, and the king tells his troops, this isn't David, this is just some fool. I got enough of those people around here. Get rid of this guy. So they kick him out, and David is spared from being captured and killed, presumably. David runs off to a cave we'll call it, in a place called Adullam, where others eventually come to join him there. It's heard that he's there. Other men of Israel who are disenfranchised with Saul, or who Saul says owes the money or tribute or whatever, they start gathering with David in this cave. Must have been a large cave, as over 400 men eventually gather up in this cave together. before David went to the cave, he stopped to see the high priest Ahimelech, who knew nothing of David's problems with Saul. And David gets him to give him some provisions and actually the sword of Goliath that was being kept there. Somebody tells Saul that Ahimelech actually helped David to escape knowingly. And so Saul goes to see Ahimelech himself. He takes with him his troops, and when he gets there in a rage, he accuses Ahimelech of treason and tells his troops that they should kill Ahimelech, his sons, his whole family, and all of the priests of Israel that are there with him, as he is the high priest. There's a picture here of that too. This picture is by, who did this? It's called Slaughter of the Priests by Otto Ellinger. And in this you can see over here, we have Saul sitting down looking rather pompous in himself, and next to him are some of the troops who are conferring amongst each other that they can't believe that Saul has asked them to actually kill the high priests and the priests while they are dressed in their priestly robes. And over here you can see Saul's head henchman, whose name was Doug, or Doug, as I like to call him, is going ahead and he is going off to slay the priests here. He does end up killing Ahimelech, his whole family, except for one son who escapes to the cave that David is in. 86 in all are slaughtered by Doug and his own men. As I said, one of Saul's sons does escape to be in the cave with David. After this, David and Saul play a little game of cat and mouse where David's constantly on the run with his troops. Saul and his men are constantly trying to chase him down. David constantly is staying one step ahead of Saul and all of Saul's troops. After hearing in one episode, so to speak, after hearing that David is in the wilderness in Engadi, Saul takes 3,000 of his best men. He goes after David. While they're on their journey, they are passing by a cave, and I guess Saul, needing to relieve himself and wanting to do it privately, goes into this cave to have some privacy. Little does he know, it's the very cave that David and his 400 troops are hiding out in. So David's troops try to get David to sneak up and kill Saul while he is relieving himself. And David, knowing that, constantly saying, Saul, even though he's trying to kill me, is God's anointed, and I will not kill him. So David sneaks up on Saul instead and cuts off a piece of the hem of his garment. You'll see a picture that we have right here. This picture is from, oh, wait a minute, I skipped something. That's the wrong picture. Okay, we'll go to a different picture. Picture 5. This picture is of, I hope. No, that's not it. Go back another one. All right, we're getting this here. It's the one in your, no, go back to the left, the first one you had. The first one. Yes, that one, the left hand. There we go. Here we are. This is, this is David over here sneaking up towards Saul, who they show sleeping. This picture is by Petrus Magadi. Apparently he did not want to paint Saul relieving himself, so instead he painted Saul sleeping and David keeping his own troops from, David's keeping his own troops from killing Saul, and instead he ends up cutting off a piece of his garment, and then after Saul leaves the cave, he rushes outside and he calls out to Saul and says, look, I could have killed you just now. I have the hem of your garment. I was that close. I just want to prove to you that no matter what you're hearing from other people, I am not trying to kill you. In which case Saul says, I'm so sorry. How could I have listened to them? Big mistake on my part. They split up ways. No sooner does Saul get back home than within a day or two, he's back on it again. He's got to find a way to kill David. Okay, well, we're still working out the whole thing about the pictures. That was my bad. I think we were on the right picture to start with. I just got us off track. Next. Okay, so David goes on to say that he would never kill Saul. I told you that. Saul breaks down and says he knows that the Lord will make David the next king and the greatest king of Israel, and Israel will flourish under their rule. He says to David that he swears that he will never try to kill him or his family again. He asks David to swear to him that when he does become king one day, he doesn't kill Saul's family or any of his himself. And David promises and makes an oath with Saul, and Saul returns home, and David and his troops go back into the cave. This brings us to the 25th chapter of 1 Samuel, and the point of our story where Samuel's life does come to an end. Presumably of old age for the prophet Samuel. It's a terrible day for Israel. It's a terrible day for David. He trusted in his friendship with Samuel all these many years. Samuel, of course, and Saul are out of sorts, but it's a very sad day for Israel as Samuel dies. David and his men have an encounter at this point, an interesting encounter that we read about in the Bible, with a nasty man named Nabal. Nabal's name means stupid fool. David tries to talk with Nabal like a man, and he's been keeping an eye on all of his people and the flocks and kind of protecting them. But Nabal wants nothing to do with David and ends up insulting him. Fortunately for Nabal, he's got a very smart wife named Abigail. Abigail, not without Nabal, her husband's knowledge, gathers up a tribute of food and jewels and everything she can gather and gets her servants to take her out towards where she understands David is coming to kill Nabal and all of her family and people for this injustice that Nabal has done. She catches up with David. We do have a picture of that. That would be our fifth picture. That looks like it right there. Yes. Let me see what I can do here. So we have David over here behind me, and he is coming up. You can see Abigail there, and Abigail's got some things for him, and you can see David and all of his troops coming up towards him over there. Abigail convinces David, kneels down, tells him what a great guy he is, tells him what a fool her husband is, and pleads with David to not kill her people, her family, and Nabal. David is very much taken with her. We are told in the Bible that she's a very beautiful and smart and quick-witted woman. And David is very taken with her, sends her home, tells her it's all going to be okay. She goes home, finds out her husband is having thrown a party, totally oblivious to the fact that he and all of his family were nearly killed just days earlier by David and his troops. When he sobers up the next morning, she tells him everything that's happened, and he is so shocked that he has a stroke and is paralyzed, and some few days later he actually dies from that stroke. When this happens, David finds out about it. We realize he was rather smitten with Abigail. He sends word to her that if she would have him, he would like her to be his wife. He has since no longer the wife of Michal, Saul's daughter, who Saul put an end to that. And Abigail says she would have just as soon even been one of David's slaves, let alone his wife, and so she happily agrees to marry him. Now, despite Saul's seeming peace with David, when he hears that David is away from his stronghold, he takes again 3,000 of his best troops and goes after David again. This time, while Saul and his troops are sleeping, David sneaks into the camp, sneaks right up next to Saul, steals his personal jug of water and his spear, sneaks back out of camp again, and then from a short distance outside of camp in the darkness, he calls out, waking up Saul and all of his troops, and points out to Saul that Saul's spear is no longer there. And David tells him, I've got your spear. Not only do I have your spear, I could have rammed it right into you, but I didn't. Because I'm not trying to kill you. How many times do I have to tell you that? I'm not trying to kill you. Why are you trying to kill me? So Saul, again, embarrassed, says, I'm a terrible guy. I'm a terrible king. I'm sorry, David, I lied. I don't know what came over with me. I'll never try to kill you again. And Saul and his troops leave. But they don't say it, but I think David's starting to figure out that Saul's going to try to kill him no matter what. So, okay, so where are we? So, in chapter 27, David finally seems to come to understanding, no matter what he does, Saul is going to try to kill him. So he returns to the land of the Philistines, this time telling King Achish who he is, and that Saul's trying to kill him, and he is basically washing his hands of the Israelite people. And he asks for the king to allow him to live in Philistine with his men, to keep them safe with their families. The king agrees to it. So he gives them the city called Zaglag, to be their own city. And David and his troops and their families and all their stock, livestock, and children end up settling together in Zaglag. David and his troops go out occasionally and raid towns and villages that are not Philistine. They're from the Amalekites and other tribes around there. But every time David does it, and he comes back with goods, he tells King Achish that he had been raiding towns, Israelite towns in Judah. So King Achish is thinking to himself, well, the Israelites must be hating David. Certainly David can never go back to them again, and I can use this to my advantage because I know that David and his troops are top-notch fighters. They've been thwarting us for years, so I'm going to make them my personal bodyguards at some point. I'll talk to you about that in just a minute. Okay, so it turns out that the Philistines go back to war with Israel again. King Achish tells David he expects his men now to fight against the Israelites, and he wants them to form his own personal bodyguards at the back end of all of his armies and his troops. As the armies kind of get together and they're encamped, the Israelites in one area and the Philistines in another, some of the Philistine commanders note that David and his troops are marching at the back of their lines. And they turn to King Achish and say, we don't trust him. The last thing we want is to be facing Israelites to the front of us and David to the rear of us. So Achish sends David and his troops back to Zaglag. When they get there, David and his troops find out that Zaglag has been raided by the Amalekites. They've taken away all of their things, their wives, their children. They didn't kill anybody. They just took all their people. David, after prayer and consulting God, goes after, him and his men go after the Amalekites. They overrun them. They get back all of their people. They kill many of the Amalekites. Others scatter or under the winds, and he gets all their people back. But Zaglag at this point has been kind of razed to the ground. So we get a scene then comes back to the armies of the Philistines and the armies of the Israelites who are lined up against each other. Saul consults a medium to find out if he is going to be successful against the Philistines, and the medium calls up our old friend Samuel. So Samuel appears in front of Saul and says, why have you disturbed me? Apparently he was sleeping soundly. And he says, why have you disturbed me? What is it you want from me? And Saul says, I want to know if we're going to be successful against the Philistines. And he says, hell no. They're going to wipe you out. They're going to wipe out all the Israelites. They're going to wipe out you, your sons, everything. Now leave me alone. And Samuel disappears. So as you can imagine, Saul is greatly grieved by the whole situation and the impending battle. He knows now that he is going to be defeated. The next day, the Philistine army assembles, They come after the Israelites, they have a battle, and the Israelites are routed. 3 of Saul's sons. In one verse I found it was 3 of Saul's sons. Later it says all 3 of Saul's sons. So I'm not sure if he has other sons or not. Including our good friend Jonathan, are all killed in battle. Saul himself is wounded severely. He turns to his armor bearer and begs him to take his sword and kill him, lest the Philistines catch up with them and end up taunting him and torturing him and making some example of him. But Saul's armor bearer just can't bring himself to do it. So Saul takes out his sword, props it up, and falls on his own sword. We have a picture of that here. This is a painting by Petrus Legati. Okay, let me see if I can figure out where I'm standing and where I need to stand. Okay, over here we have the horse, and you can see Saul just kind of under his horse and his sword propped up, stuck up against him. On the other side, you see the battle going on back here in the background. They're all fighting each other. And over here, you can see with another horse, that's supposed to be Saul's armor bearer, who also, after he realizes that Saul is dead, he falls on his own sword to kill himself. So Saul, all of his sons, his armor bearer is killed, and the Israelites are routed, and the Philistines win a great battle, and they're all very happy about that. They end up, the towns, and the Israelite towns in the surrounding area, the people run for their lives after they realize that the Israelites have been defeated. The Philistines raid into the towns and spend the night there, then come back out the next morning, and they are pillaging the Israelite soldiers out in the field. They come across Saul and his sons, and they behead Saul, and they dismember his sons, and they take him to a nearby city, the city of Gilead, and they nail their body parts up on the outside city walls. Gruesome, I know. So, but that night, I'm sorry, it wasn't Gilead. It was Beth-shan was the name of the city. Because the men of Gilead, some distance off, heard about this travesty, and they sneak down to Beth-shan in the middle of the night and go to the city walls and take down all the pieces and body parts of Saul and his sons, and they take them back to Gilead, where they burn the pieces in a ceremony, a ritual, and take the bones and bury them properly as should be befitting the king and his sons. Okay. That's about it. That's where we end up at the end of 1 Samuel. To begin with, Samuel is not book 1 and book 2. In the original manuscripts, the Hebrew writings, the book of Samuel is just one big, long book. And trust me, that is a big, long book. It's taken us weeks and weeks and weeks to get through just 1 Samuel. The stories are just so intense, one after another. It's such important stories. So, in our next session, we will start up with Samuel 2, David's revenge. And Saul is now dead, his sons are dead, and David won't just step up into being made king immediately, but we will start that trend that moves towards David becoming the greatest king of all Israel. I thank you for being with us today. I hope you've enjoyed some of these stories and some of the information about it. Mostly, I have to tell you, I'm using paintings from folks who painted these things because we're still at a point in the Bible where there is no archaeological evidence of any kind. David, though, in his reign, we're going to start to see a change right there, because the city of David and David's monarchy, archaeologists have uncovered some little tidbits of the times of David, and that's going to start to get real interesting with what I can show you there. So thank you for being with us today. I thank you again for being a part of our journey to Damascus, and I hope you'll see us again next time. Thank you. We hope you have enjoyed our discoveries for today. Please join us next time as we explore the insights of the Old Testament on the journey to Damascus.